I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 94th episode in this podcast dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This week we are going to be talking about the application of electricity to the brain. This is going to be a technology-rich episode of Smart Drug Smarts. We're not going to be talking about pharmaceuticals so much, but instead the careful manipulation of the brain with electric and magnetic fields. We're going to be talking about deep brain stimulation and transcranial technologies. We've talked about TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, on a couple of episodes before. We're also going to be speaking about transcranial magnetic stimulation this time with our interview guest, Dr. James Giordano. He is a professor in the departments of neurology and biochemistry at Georgetown University. He consults with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and he's both very well versed and passionately interested in the current state of the art and the near future possibilities for the technological enhancement of the human brain. But that'll be in the main interview. If you hang around until the end of the episode, in the ruthless listener retention gimmick, somewhat inspired by some recent conversations I've had with the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, going to be giving you some statistics about our astronauts and the sorts of physical craziness that they've got to deal with to keep their bodies functional and their environments somewhat resource neutral while they're living in space. That'll be in the ruthless listener retention gimmick, but as usual, let's kick things off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So I mentioned last week that I'm sort of seeing a meta theme developing in some Smart Drug Smarts episodes about the ability to use technological means, and I'm using the really general term of technology here, including things like pharmaceutical technologies, but using technological means to alter moral and ethical decision-making processes. I just think this is fascinatingly interesting that this is something that we can approach scientifically and mechanistically now and isn't just a realm of philosophy. And appropriate to the fact that we're going to be talking in the main interview about transcranial magnetic stimulation, there's new work by researchers at Vanderbilt University and Harvard that is using something called repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation on a specific brain area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which it turns out is instrumental when a person is deliberating assigning punishment for bad behavior in another human. The study used 66 volunteer men and women, and these subjects were given a variety of hypothetical situations where somebody had committed a crime, but there were various levels of blame and a wide range of potential punishments that could be applied. So everything from accidentally leaving a wet slip and slide on your driveway and somebody slips and falls and you really should have known better, to cold-blooded calculated murder and everything in between. But what's interesting here is that there's really two entirely separate axes that the researchers could independently alter using repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. Whether somebody was perceived to be guilty or not, and the amount of punishment that they were thought to deserve didn't move in lockstep with one another. Researchers could make somebody more likely to be heavily punished without necessarily moving the dial on whether they were considered to be guilty of the crime. Said the study's lead author Joshua Buchholz, temporarily disrupting the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex function appears to alter how people use information about harm and culpability to render decisions. In other words, punishment requires that people balance these two influences, and the RTMS manipulation interfered with this balance, especially under conditions in which these factors are dissonant, such as when the intent is clear but the harm outcome is mild. Studies like this, I think, will be continuing to open up just huge ethical cans of worms about how law is practiced, as it becomes clear that the actual physiology of our brains has giant effects on what feels fair in determining guilt, innocence, and reasonable amounts of punishment. Like, what should a punishment enforced by a law court actually be for? Should it be something that feels right to the jurist? Should it be something that feels right to the judge? Should it be something that feels right to the party who was wronged? And whatever our answer is to that, does it change things? Should it change things, knowing that we now have the technological means to alter what feels right in those cases? It was a good week for Smart Drug Smarts on iTunes. We picked up 3 5-star reviews. Thank you oh so much for those of you that are taking the time to do this. It's really a big boost for the show. iTunes is the 800-pound gorilla of podcast syndication, so ranking well in their search algorithm really helps people find out about the show. Of course, word of mouth does too, so let me not diminish those of you who are just whispering Smart Drug Smarts into people's ears. That's awesome too. Listener Leopold83 said, "My favorite podcast right now." ASDF Qwerty Flirty says, "This show is packed full of the details I crave as a mom of kids with neurotransmitter and health issues. I love the unapologetic openness to the nitty-gritty weird science that I think is the cutting edge. And Geekwing says, Smart Drug Smarts is part of my favorite weekly work routine, and it keeps getting better and better. Making science accessible, especially neuroscience that confounds most non-science researchers, is so important. Great job, and I'm looking forward to the next episode. Thanks to those of you who wrote in over the course of the past week with your favorite Smart Drug Smarts episodes from the past. It's been good to hear what's resounding with different people out there. I also got an email from a listener about last week's episode saying that it has already improved his love life, which I think is the first time I've gotten an email like that from this podcast. But of course, last week was a very special episode, probably our second ever adults-only Smart Drug Smarts episode. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll need to go back and check episode number 93, which has both some blush-inducing and also extremely interesting stuff in there. And finally, I would like to thank those of you who have been trying out the Axon Labs products, Nexus and Mitogen, available at axonlabs.io. I've been speaking about those for, I think it's 9 weeks now that those have been out and available, and it's kind of cool to see a blip in the sales that humps up every weekend when the episodes come out. So obviously some of you guys are hearing these episodes being like, oh yeah, there's that thing that Jesse's talking about again, and trying it. That is very much appreciated and gratifying for us to get to help you out with your cognitive and or metabolic needs with those two stacks. So if you haven't done so and you happen to have a web browser handy, do not be shy about taking a look over at axonlabs.io.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we're going to be speaking with Dr. James Giordano, who is quite the man about town in the world of neuroscience. He is the co-director of the O'Neill Pellegrino Program for Brain Science and Global Health Law and Policy at Georgetown University in the U.S. He is a Clark Faculty Fellow in Neurosciences and Ethics at the Human Sciences Center of the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, Germany. He is Senior Science Advisory Fellow to the Strategic Multilayer Analysis Group of the Joint Staff at the Pentagon, author of over 200 publications on neuroscience and ethics, and a guy whose opinion really matters at the policy level because of the groups and people he's advising. Dr. Giordano is somebody that I was lucky enough to be on a radio panel with a couple of weeks ago, and that's how we got to know one another. And today we're going to be talking about different ways of stimulating the brain with both electricity and magnetic fields, both inside the skull and outside the skull. We've had a couple of episodes previously where we've talked about transcranial direct current stimulation. We're going to be speaking about that again today, but also with its sibling technology, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and a much more invasive procedure called deep brain stimulation, which, as you might imagine, takes place on the inside of the skull and is something which currently is really only a corrective technology when somebody's had a neurological condition or some sort of brain trauma. But even technologies like this might find their way from being strictly corrective like they are now to an elective, cosmetic, intelligence amplification procedure at some point in the future. So we'll be looking at these technologies both in their present state and a little bit of speculation about where this might go in the near future. So with no further ado, Dr. James Giordano.
Deep brain stimulation, I think, represents one of those areas that's probably truly the cutting edge of where we're going with the interface between brain science and neurotechnology. Deep brain stimulation has been around for a while. It had been first used to treat movement disorders, such as Parkinsonism, and then increasingly became viewed as a viable option for treating other neuropsychiatric conditions. Probably the one that is best known is treating forms of depression, and certainly one of the pioneers in the field is Dr. Helen Mayberg. As we begun to understand more and more of the network aspects of the brain, we were also seeing that the forms of deep brain stimulation that were being used, a single electrode that had a circumferential electrical field, was kind of crude. So you had two things that were developing at the same time. We had the change in the theoretical understanding of the way neural networks operate and the connectivities of the brain. And certainly this was enthused by advanced studies in various forms of neuroimaging and mapping. And at the same time, we were seeing that theoretical construct, that working understanding of the way the brain operates, not only in health, but also in certain disease states, would suggest that we could be far more specific in our sharpshooting, if you will, of how to target various networks, nuclei within the brain, and do so with this deep brain stimulation approach. So over the past 10 years, the actual technology of deep brain stimulation has gained in sophistication and complication, so that now the iteration that is probably the state of the art is something that is referred to as the Omni device, which is the octopus multiple neurological implant device, which engages multiple neurological implants, multiple electrodes. These electrodes are actually studded with multiple electrode contact points that are directionable. In other words, it's not just a big round electrical field, but you can actually direct the scope and direction of where the current is going and do that differentially. And this is also closed loop. So it's not only stimulating certain nodes and networks within the brain, it's also recording on a local field level network level, and then ultimately a whole brain system level that can then be yoked to external inputs, including how is the individual behaving or feeling. This is very, very sophisticated, Jesse. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, this is the ultimate level in brain interfacing.
The fact that octopus is part of the name makes me at least envision it, that there's a lot of contact points within the brain. How is this actually inserted into a person?
Well, a couple of things go along with that question. It's a really provocative question because the leader right now, the leading agency that is right at the cutting edge, is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA. And, as soon as you mention DARPA, I think what happens is there are certain people who suddenly think, well, this is Darth Vader science. And in all transparency, I must tell you that we're speaking here on the record, and I serve as a consulting neuroethicist for DARPA's deep brain stimulation project called SubNets, which is systems-based neuroscience for emerging therapies, and also as a consulting neuroethicist for a related project, which is called Restoring Active Memory, or RAM. So what I'm about to tell you is not classified information. This is all exists on the white side, and listeners can go to the DARPA website, which is www.darpa.mil, and look up subnets and RAM. It's very exciting, but you've raised an interesting point. How do you get these things in there? Well, the same way you always got electrodes into the brain, this is a neurosurgical procedure. And obviously it requires a neurosurgeon to do this. And that's important to understand because there have been some things floating around on the internet of DARPA putting recording chips or stimulating chips in people's heads when they're getting dental work, and that just doesn't happen. This is a medical technique that is really being pioneered to treat neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's, but also depression, certain forms of anxiety, chronic pain, addiction, and impulse control disorders such as Tourette's disease, and a host of other potential issues, memory loss, neurodegenerative dementia, inclusive of Alzheimer's dementia, and in some cases, brain injury, to actually restore mechanisms that are involved in cognition, emotion, and behaviors. So this is not only cutting edge in terms of the technology and the technique, it's also cutting edge with regard to its capability to restore brain function. Very, very exciting. How this gets into the head, again, at this point, it's a question of neurosurgical intervention. A borehole is drilled into the skull by a neurosurgeon, and the device is stereotactically implanted onto the surface of the brain, and the electrodes are then penetrated down deeper into the various nodes or nuclei that affect certain networks that are involved in whatever the pathological condition is. So again, this is a neurosurgical procedure that is done in a neurosurgical suite. The recovery time is very, very short. And in reality, when we actually calibrate the amount of current, the direction of current, which is done in the neurosurgical theater, the results can be dramatic and very, very quick. So in other words, the individual initiates recovery almost immediately.
Having covered deep brain stimulation a bit there, could you talk a little bit about some of the variety of different techniques that we have for transcranial technologies, whether it's transcranial magnetic stimulation, alternating current, direct current? Direct current we've talked about some in past episodes, and that seems to be the one that has made the most headway in sort of the consumer sphere. But what are some of the pros and cons of these different technologies?
Well, as you'd mentioned, I mean, these are transcranial, so I think the major pro is they don't require neurosurgical implantation, and they can easily be done in a physician's office. And of course, as you mentioned, there's also a direct-to-consumer viability here with transcranial electrical stimulation, which would suggest that they need not even be done in a clinician's office. These can be done in a paraclinical situation, such as we would see perhaps in the workspace or in a training space. And in fact, there's a lot of effort being applied to studies that are looking at particularly transcranial electrical stimulation and magnetic stimulation to improve certain aspects of cognitive performance, task performance, cognitive and motor performance, in a variety of different occupational settings, from the military all the way to the industrial to the professional, such as intellectual forms of workspaces, problem solving, ability to learn medical tasks, remember legal briefs, etc. So I think that the transcranial electrical stimulation forms, and you mentioned one, which is transcranial direct current stimulation, and there are two others that are being widely used and investigated, transcranial alternating stimulation, and also transcranial oscillating current stimulation, probably of the ones that have the most ease with regard to use. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is somewhat more specific in its effects, and we also understand the mechanisms a bit better than transcranial electrical stimulation. But at this point in time, it still requires clinical administration, and the reasons for that are twofold. First, the device itself is fairly pricey. The actual magnet that is necessary to engage transcranial magnetic stimulation is price prohibitive for most direct-to-consumer applications and at-home use. And number two, the specificity of effect that needs to be generated with transcranial magnetic stimulation in terms of where the actual magnet needs to be applied requires clinical specificity. So at this point in time, TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, is mostly limited to the clinical sphere. But transcranial electrical stimulation really have begun to gain some momentum because there's been increased specificity of where we can put the electrodes, which is called a montage, the current that is applied, which again is very, very low current, but also our understanding of the brain. So this is another one of these interesting opportunities that you see the waltz between our understanding of the brain and the way a brain works and our ability to then develop more sophisticated technologies to then engage that understanding, and then we gain more knowledge from that. So this is what is called a tools to theory and theory to tools heuristic. And I think that the transcranial electrical stimulation approaches, together with DBS, of course, are a wonderful opportunity to see this in action.
Tell us a little about the extra specificity that's available from transcranial magnetic stimulation, what that actually translates into in practice as far as effects that we might be able to sort of get pinpoint accuracy on that's not quite as easily reachable with the electric stimulation techniques.
Sure. Well, again, I think what your listeners need to recall is that we're having this conversation in September of 2015, and this field changes so rapidly that this might actually shift within a month or two as we develop greater specificity for what we're looking to do with TES, transcranial electrical stim. What transcranial electrical stimulation does is it changes the relative thresholds of firing of certain groups of nerve cells in a certain area of the brain. So what it's really doing is it's sort of working like a rheostat on an electrical switch. It's not really turning it on or off. It's actually modifying the level or intensity at which those nerve cells are then firing or responding. So the state dependency, the state of the brain, the state of the person, the environmental contexts in which transcranial electrical stimulation is applied is very, very important. And that's one of the things we're learning from our mechanistic studies of TES. On the other hand, with TMS, it's not just a question of modulating the existing level of activity, which it does to some extent as well, but it can be somewhat more potent in literally flipping the switch on and off, turning certain neurons on or off, and or actually engaging the fact that they have a longer period of activity or a shorter period of activity. So I think that the difference here is not only specificity of effect, but that the effects differ somewhat in terms of what the actual currents are doing. The electromagnetic pulse of TMS versus the electrical pulses and the form of the electrical pulse, whether direct or alternating or oscillating in transcranial electric stimulation. I really look at the transcranial electrical stimulation approaches more as neurological nudging rather than an on-off. They're sort of nudging the way these nodes and networks are operating and functioning in a certain directional way rather than turning them completely on or completely off.
If we're operating within the brain's normal parameters, and this really isn't anything more than a nudge electrically, we're not doing something that the brain couldn't be doing on its own. With the brain having been honed by bazillions of years of evolution as it is, why isn't the brain doing this already?
Well, I think the brain does this already in plenty of circumstances and situations. And one of the things that we're seeing is if people are actually working at what may be considered a viable ceiling of their performance cognitively or behaviorally, transcranial electrical stimulation isn't going to do much to make them superhuman. That's not what's happening here. But it's when you begin to see decrements or when you begin to see patterns of effect within certain neurological networks that are not, quote, up to par. Or what's happened is a particular neurological network may not necessarily be firing in the right way, or they may have gotten into a pattern of firing that they cannot autocorrect for a number of reasons. Habit, difficulty of task, engagement of other prior neurological network entrainments. So the brain may be stuck, if you will. And so what transcranial electrical stimulation appears to do is, once again, to use the metaphor, nudge brain activity in certain directions that the brain may not be able to do in certain circumstances on its own. Again, that speaks very strongly to the potential utility and value of approaches like transcranial electrical and transcranial magnetic stimulation because of their either nudge or on-off capacity, respectively.
So for someone like, let's say, is a 17-year-old gamer who's thinking of buying one of these devices at a consumer level to use to be able to beat up their friends in whatever their video game of choice is, this theoretical kid has no reason to think that any of his brain systems aren't working as well as they should. Is he or she going to be able to expect any sort of real increment there, other than luck of the draw, like happening to find the one brain system that isn't working so well and needs a nudge?
I have to chuckle. Jesse, that's the bazillion-dollar question. That's the question I think that not only those of us in neuroscience and neurotechnology are poised at the end of our seats waiting to answer, but I'm sure there are a whole bunch of people who have their fingers in the proverbial financial pie of direct-to-consumer transcranial electrical stimulation that are like, let's see what really happens. This is a great experiment. I mean, truly, this is a huge public experiment, because I think one of the things that it really is demonstrating is the very old neuroscientific adage, see one brain, see one brain. I mean, if you think about it, a brain is an organ of relationship. I mean, structure and function are closely related. It's Jerry Edelman's old concept that neurons that fire together wire together, and the things that make our nerve cells fire are going to be quite different based upon our environment, our upbringing, our circumstances, things that have happened to us. So my brain is in some ways different than your brain, different than somebody else's brain. The question is, without doing that mapping beforehand, without seeing what particular brain nodes and networks are differentially, individually, and selectively active or inactive, can we make particular generalizations about the way these techniques and technologies would work that are going to be applicable and valid and therefore valuable? And the answer appears to be maybe. So as this, quote, gets out of the bag more and more, what becomes very important is to acquire that information as to who's doing what with this stuff, what they're doing, when they're doing it, and how it's working. So it's really a question of what works, under what circumstances, when, and in whom. Then the task is going to be figure out what is it about those situations and those individuals that render that success. So what's that level of interaction between the technology and the technique and the individual and the circumstances in which these are being employed? And once we get out to this in the sort of general public populational effect, that information is going to become more and more important. Like anything else, if this is going to be released for public use, and I think that there's some real viability in it being released for public use, and we know it's already out there in public use, we need to understand how it will work, in whom, and under what circumstances. Even for those devices that are being directly marketed to the consumer, they will come with particular caveats on the label. Use it this way, use it that way, don't use it if you have a pre-existing medical condition, etc. But Jesse, you know as well as I do that once you let things out into the consumer sphere, people are going to use it as they darn well please. I mean, I can tell somebody, here, I'm going to sell you a chainsaw. You should really only use this to chop wood. And there's going to be some idiot who decides to juggle it after having 6 beers. So I think what becomes important to understand is how people are using this, when they're using it, for what, and what are the different circumstances and conditions of the use, and when is it successful and when is it not. And that's really going to be an explosive area of this field as we move into the next 5 years of progress and development. Because what's happening here, Jesse, is the more we do this work, the more we understand about the brain. And the more we understand about the brain, then the more specific and the more precise we can be in developing tools and techniques to engage the brain.
That sort of dovetails nicely into something that I'd like to ask you about, which is your position as an advisor on neuroethics. So as we do gain this better understanding of the brain, how it works, and the ability to essentially direct the mechanisms of our brain, we get into these questions of not just such and such person has a congenital disease or got in a car accident and bumped their head too hard and we want to get them back to having a standard Homo sapiens brain, but instead the question becomes, here's a standard Homo sapiens brain, here's how it behaves. We like some of the things about how it behaves. We don't like others. What would we like it to do next as we sort of direct our own physiological evolution?
Well, Jesse, I think you've, in some cases, hit the nail on the head and in so doing popped open Pandora's box. I mean, it's that whole idea of what constitutes treatment or what constitutes optimization or enhancement is really, I think, explicit to the whole smart drug smarts idea. And certainly a lot of what we see with regard to the neuroethical discourse and some of the debates really come down to the same issue. Is this treatment? Are we treating something? Well, I think in some cases the answer is definitively yes. We recognize that there's a disorder here or there's a dysfunction. But you got to be a little cautious here too, because remember, we're also using the neurosciences to define what represents a normal brain. So here we're using the technology to establish the basis of what is the norm. And that shifts as well as a consequence of the technologies, their specificity, and the metrics we use. And if you look at this on a bell curve, let's just suppose we're going to take a Gaussian distribution, a bell curve. We say, well, clearly these are individuals who are on the lower end of that bell curve. Well, the goal here is to use these techniques and technologies to bring these individuals under that area of whatever mean we would say is represents viable health. And there is actually a metric. Characteristically, what we say is anything below minus 2 standard deviations of whatever mean we've decided upon. Well, that represents a notable explicit disorder. But there's a gray zone. What about those people who are a couple of clicks off the center line? What about those individuals who are at the center line or above the center line who want to increase their capability and performance because of a variety of reasons? Let's face it, we're not necessarily just going out and hunting and gathering any longer and knocking rocks together. There's a huge personal, professional, public, socio-cultural, and economic incentive for us to improve our cognitive and emotional capabilities. Could we, in fact, engage these techniques and technologies to be able to once again nudge that mean rightward? In other words, increase the mean, or in some cases, give individuals the capability to be on the upper end of that bell-shaped curve. I think the answer there is yes, we can. The larger question is, well, should we?
The fun thing is that you're the guy that's advising DARPA on the answer to this question. So I would love to give you free rein to give your own opinion here, because to a certain extent, you're one of the main voices in this argument. What are your personal feelings?
Well, my personal feelings and my professional feelings in this particular case are really interwoven. And clearly what I'm advising DARPA on is a professional side. And of course, I say that after having had my morning cup of coffee, right? So, I think humans desire to engage tools at their disposal, not only to improve their survivability, but also to expand our window of flourishing, has been the norm. It has been the norm. I mean, we are Homo sapiens technicus. And that's important. We've used tools to increase the capability of what we do and do it well. Obviously, these DARPA programs, such as Subnets, RAM, and the newest one called RAM Replay, are specifically and explicitly aimed at treating disease states, neuropsychiatric disease states that have imposed upon patients the burden of dysfunction, disorder, and incapacity. The translational capability of the techniques and technologies outside of those things that are being supported by the DARPA studies, I think, is huge, because it then advances the techniques and the tools. So outside of the parameters of these studies that have been funded by DARPA, if we now look, for example, to those studies that are going to be funded by the National Institutes of Health and ongoing studies that are utilizing these tools in their next iteration, in the next generation of their sophistication, for example, the Omni device, the question then becomes, what will we use these things for? Once these things become available on the broad clinical market, if you will, what will they be used for? And the larger issue is, well, what is that clinical market? Is there also, for example, a boutique market for the way particularly these transcranial approaches will be used? Let's take a look at, is that really a problem? Might we also have a market for what I'll call designer deep brain stimulation, medical tourism for deep brain stimulation? And the answer to that question is yes, absolutely there will be. And that's something that concerns me, both as a neuroscientist and as a neuroethicist. Because once these tools and techniques are in fact broadly available, constraining their use, I think, is only bounded by the relative capabilities of our constraint. But once the tools and techniques are broadly available, then the palette of potential uses widens. And it becomes very difficult to regulate and control the way these things are going to be used on a global scale. Do I foresee a much broader do-it-yourself, direct-to-consumer medical tourism and boutique neurology and boutique psychiatry market that may be budding within the next 5 years as these tools become far more available? You bet I do. Do we need to be prepared for that neuroethically, legally, and socially? Absolutely.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so much to Dr. James Giordano for taking the time for that interview. He was extremely gracious with his time. We spoke for probably about an hour and 20 minutes, and needless to say, not all of that made it into the episode that you just heard, but there are several more episodes worth of conversation to be had with Dr. Giordano. So many interesting things that we learned in that. We got the neurological catchphrase that we hadn't heard before, the C1 brain, C1 brain. Talking about the hyper-specificity of each of our brains, where drawing inferences about one brain from another is a precariously difficult thing to do in a lot of cases. And also talking about some of these invasive brain technologies, the things like deep brain stimulation, which aren't just a wearable apparatus on the outside that can easily be switched out, but something that you're making much more of a biological commitment to when you have something actually implanted in your head. Kind of the difference between wearing a pair of glasses and getting a retinal transplant. But it opens up some really fascinating issues because hardware technology changes so fast. If you think about a computer from 10 years ago versus a computer now, the advances that have been made in that time, both as far as processor speed and energy requirements and heat output and all those things. Right now, I think it seems fairly obvious that most of us would not want to have something actually surgically implanted into our skulls unless it was overcoming a really, really serious physical malady. But with 5 years, 10 years, 15 years of advancing technology, that might not be the case. It might be worth maybe a small procedure. But then you've got the question of, well, if I get it put in 10 years from now, and then 10 years after that, the technology's gotten even better, am I going to want to get one thing pulled out of my skull to get something swapped in? It leads to some really interesting questions about when to be an adopter of a new technology. It's a lot more consequential of a question than wondering if you should buy the first generation 3D TV or wait for a couple generations before the technology stabilizes or comes down in price or whatever. But anyway, future conversations there. For right now, let's jump over to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So I was watching a documentary recently about nuclear energy, and it made a really interesting point about background radiation here on Earth and how different parts of the Earth geographically, for no reasons related to nuclear catastrophes or anything like that, just have wildly different amounts of background radiation. And the filmmakers took a Geiger counter up on a commercial airline, which flies about 30,000 feet up, and made the interesting point that simply by being in an airline, you're getting way, way, way more radiation exposure than you would on the surface of the Earth at most locations. So it was looking up some statistics about spending time in space. In this case, this is some data about astronaut Scott Kelly, who just went up to the International Space Station, is going to be there the next year. He's going to get an amount of radiation from being on the International Space Station that's equivalent to 5,250 Los Angeles to New York airline flights. But that's not all. Some other interesting astronaut statistics. In that time, he will see 10,944 sunrises and sunsets. So about 16 a day when you're talking Earth days. And if you're talking with an 8-year-old or an immature 38-year-old, you can impress them with the amazing statistic that spending a year in space, you will consume about 730 liters of recycled urine and sweat. To put that into context, your average human body is about 70 liters in volume. So yes, that is 10 adult humans worth of recycled urine. And last but not least, for those of you that have a hard time motivating yourself to exercise, know that if you were an astronaut, you'd be expected to work out 2 solid hours every single day to keep your muscles from atrophying in the weightlessness of space, which is no doubt where some of that recycled sweat comes from.
Smart Drug Smarts. We get you thinking.
Okay, that is the very end of the episode. Thank you for hanging around until the end. If you liked what you heard, please recommend this podcast to your friends. Leave us a review on iTunes. Scrawl Smart Drug Smarts in a prominent public location. If you were caught and arrested, do not implicate me as having told you to do this, but know that you will secretly have my blessing. The show notes for this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com, including all the links discussed here. I will be back at you next Friday, same time, same podcast, with what's very likely to be a Know Your Neurotransmitters episode. Not going to promise that, but odds seem good. But until then, have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.